The alley runs between two streets on the south side of Chicago. It is barely wide enough for two people to pass each other sideways. No street lights reach its center. The brick walls on both sides are old enough that the mortar between them has turned the color of ash. At night, sounds from the surrounding streets do not travel in, and sounds from inside do not travel out. On a Wednesday evening in October, a man named Jake Mercer was standing at the midpoint of that alley with two other men. They had been waiting there for 22 minutes. They knew the route. They knew the time. Someone had made sure of that. What they did not know, what nobody in that building had accounted for, was a 14-year-old girl who happened to pull her left earbud out 30 feet before the alley entrance. She stopped walking. 3 full seconds passed. Then she stepped into the dark. Jake Mercer turned when he heard her footsteps. He took in what he saw. A small figure. School uniform faded at the knees. Blue hair tie. Maybe 110 pounds on a generous day. His expression did not change. If anything, he looked almost amused. He reached out one hand toward her. Not to strike, not yet, just to push her back. The gesture of a man removing an inconvenience. The kind of motion that says, "You don't count." She did not step back. She stepped forward. What happened next took less than 2 seconds and changed the lives of everyone connected to that alley for the rest of their lives. But to understand what happened in those 2 seconds, you have to go back 72 hours. Because nothing that occurs in a single moment is ever really about that moment. The throw that sent Jake Mercer off his feet was the product of 9 years of preparation. The stillness in that girl's eyes as she walked in was the product of something older than that. This is the story of Reese Calloway. And it starts the way most important things start. Not with a dramatic event, but with a quiet morning that looked exactly like every other morning before it. The alarm on Reese's phone was set for 4:59. Not 5, not 5:30, 4:59 because the 1-minute gap between that and 5 o'clock was the only thing in her morning that belonged entirely to her. 1 minute in a narrow bed in a third-floor apartment on the south side of Chicago, with the ceiling still gray above her and the sounds of the building just beginning, a door somewhere below, a pipe, settling the distant rhythm of a delivery truck on the main road, and she would lie there and let herself be still before the day required her to move. At 5 o'clock exactly, she got up. The apartment was small in the way that apartments like that are always small, not just in square footage, but in ceiling height, in the distance between the kitchen counter and the opposite wall, and the way two people had to turn sideways in the hallway to pass each other. The elevator in the building broke on average twice a month. The hallway lights flickered every time someone down the corridor slammed a door with the particular force that people who are tired and frustrated slam doors. The window in the main room looked out onto the backside of another building whose windows looked back with the same exhausted expression. This was the third floor of a building on the south side of Chicago, in the kind of neighborhood where corner stores stayed open until midnight, and church murals faded slowly on brick walls, and everyone knew everyone else's business whether they wanted to or not. A neighborhood where the price of a gallon of milk had not changed in 3 years, but the rent had changed twice. Where the bus ran every 22 minutes if the schedule held, which it did not always do. Where people built lives inside constraints that the rest of the city preferred not to think about, and they built them with the specific stubborn competence of people who do not have the option of doing otherwise. Reese Calloway had lived here for as long as she could remember. She moved through the kitchen in the half-dark without turning on the overhead light. She knew where everything was by feel, and by the particular silence each drawer made when it opened. The medication bottles were lined up on the second shelf above the sink exactly as she had left them the night before. She took each one down in the correct order. Read the label even though she had read it enough times to recite it from memory. Measured with precision. Her grandmother's hands shook in the mornings. Reese's never did. This was not a gift. It was not something she had been born with. It was something that had been built into her one morning at a time over years of doing this same task with the understanding that the margin for error was zero. Edna Calloway was 67 years old and had a condition that made the morning hours particularly difficult. The shaking was not constant, but it was unpredictable, and the medications had to be measured with the kind of consistency that shaking hands could not provide. So Reese measured them. Every morning, same time, same order. She placed the glass of water beside the bottles on the counter where Edna would find them when she woke, and she did it with the same quiet, unhurried precision that she brought to everything she did when nobody was watching. She was 14 years old. Her grades at school were average. If you had sat across from any of her teachers and asked them about Reese Calloway, most of them would have given you a version of the same answer: quiet kid, not a problem, does the work. Nothing remarkable. Average. A word that gets applied to young people with the casualness of a weather report, as though it describes something true and permanent, rather than just a particular set of circumstances at a particular moment in time. The truth was different. Reese was not average because she lacked ability. Anyone who spent 5 genuine minutes in conversation with her figured that out quickly. She was average because she was tired. The specific bone-deep exhaustion that only comes from carrying adult weight before your body has finished growing. The kind that does not show up on a report card as a cause, it only shows up as an effect. After school every day, she walked directly to the Webb Community Center 3 blocks east. She arrived at 3:40. She stayed until they locked the doors. The neighbors had a name for her, the quiet one. They meant it as a compliment, the way some people use quietness as a proxy for goodness, for the absence of trouble. They just did not know why she was quiet. They could not see what the quiet contained. 9 years earlier, when Reese was 5 years old, her father made one decision before he disappeared from her life permanently. He drove her to the Webb Community Center, walked her inside, found the man who ran the place, and asked him to teach her. He did not explain what she should be taught. He did not leave a number. He handed her a bag with 2 changes of clothes and a peanut butter sandwich in a plastic container, and he said, "Take care of her for a while." He did not come back. Coach Darnell Webb was 53 years old at the time. He had spent 20 years as a combatives instructor in the United States Army, 20 years of learning, refining, and teaching how to neutralize a threat twice your size using nothing but body mechanics, leverage, and timing. He had deployed twice. He had come home with a particular kind of knowledge that most people in ordinary life never have reason to acquire. When he retired from the service, he came back to the neighborhood where he had grown up, rented the ground floor of a building on the south side, put down rubber matting, and started offering free classes to children whose families could not afford anything else. He had seen a lot of kids walk through his door in the years since he opened. When Reese Calloway walked in that first day, 5 years old, bag on her back, sandwich in her hand, eyes that took in the whole room in 3 seconds, without a single thing in her expression, giving away what she thought of it, he knew within 30 seconds that she was different. Not because she was immediately talented. She was not at first. She was small and she had no baseline training, and she fell down constantly in those early weeks and months, the way all beginners fall down. But she never fell down the same way twice. That was what Webb recognized. Not raw ability. The rare thing, the capacity to absorb information through failure and convert it immediately into adjustment. Most people, when they fail at something physical, experience the failure emotionally first. They get frustrated or embarrassed or discouraged, and all of that emotion sits between them and the information they need to extract from the failure. Reese did not do that. She fell, she processed, she adjusted. Fell, processed, adjusted. With a consistency that he had seen in exactly 3 people in 20 years of teaching, she had been his most dedicated student from the first day. 9 years of Krav Maga and Judo. 9 years of learning how to read a person's body before they made their move. The micro shift of weight that precedes a reach, the specific angle of a shoulder that signals direction, the way a person's eyes give away their intention, roughly a quarter of a second before their body catches up. 9 years of learning how to use an attacker's own weight and momentum against them. How to create leverage from geometry when physical force alone was not the answer. How to end a confrontation in seconds without escalating it. She had won 2 regional tournaments under a fake name. She had entered under a different name because she did not want to be known as the girl who fights. That was the last thing she wanted. Her daily life was already complicated enough. The training was not about identity. It was not about reputation. It was not about trophies or rankings or the particular social currency that comes from being known as someone who can handle herself. It was about something quieter than that, something closer to the bone. The trophies were in the back of her locker at the community center. Not at school, not at home where her grandmother might find them and ask questions she was not ready to answer. Nobody at her school knew. She had never told them, and she intended to keep it that way. The building where Reese and her grandmother lived was managed by a man named Victor Hale. He was in his late 40s, a large man who wore dress shirts that were always slightly too tight across the shoulders, not because he could not afford better fitting ones, but because the tightness was part of the impression he wanted to make. He had a particular way of looking at people when they came into his office. A slow top-to-bottom assessment that communicated without any words that he had already formed an opinion about you and that the opinion was not favorable. He controlled the lease agreements for dozens of families in the building. He had never not once lost an argument with a tenant, not because he was always right, because every tenant understood at some level that did not need to be made explicit what losing an argument with Victor Hale could cost them. He kept files, detailed files organized with the precision of a man who understood that information was a more reliable weapon than anything physical. He knew who was behind on rent by how many days and for how many consecutive months. He knew who had a prior record, who had a restraining order in their history, who had filed a complaint with the city building inspector 3 years ago, and what had come of it. He knew which families had sick relatives, which ones were working 2 jobs, which ones were 3 weeks from a decision point that would force them to choose between medication and the month's rent. He had built this knowledge base over 11 years of managing the property, and he deployed it with the patience of someone who had learned early that leverage applied at the right moment to the right person in the right context was more effective than any confrontation. He never raised his voice. He rarely made direct threats. He did not need to. Every family in the building had eventually given him what he needed. A nod, a downward glance when he passed in the hallway. Some small, quiet signal of acknowledgement that communicated the correct understanding of the dynamic between them. Some gesture that said, "I know how this works." Every family, with one exception. Reese Calloway was 14 years old, and she looked Victor Hale directly in the eyes every single time he tried to stare her down. She had been doing it since she was 11. He could not entirely explain why it affected him the way it did. On a rational level, she was a child. She was a tenant's granddaughter. She had no legal standing in anything related to the building's management. She was in every structural sense completely irrelevant to his operation. But she looked at him, without flinching, without looking away, without the small, involuntary submission that everyone else eventually produced. She just looked back with eyes that were calm and attentive and completely steadily unconcerned with what he thought of her. He had been watching her for months, not because she had done anything wrong, because she had not done anything right, not by his definition of right, not in the way that mattered to him. There was something else Victor Hale was dealing with that fall, something that had nothing to do with Reese Calloway, at least not at first. His name was Robert Ashford. Robert Ashford was 58 years old and one of the wealthiest private citizens in the state of Illinois. His face was almost completely unknown outside of the specific circles of Chicago's financial world. He had spent 3 decades deliberately avoiding the kind of public profile that most men with his resources naturally accumulate. No charity galas, no civic board memberships, no named buildings or endowed chairs or philanthropic foundations attached to his identity. What almost nobody knew and what was not discoverable through any public record because it had been structured specifically to prevent discoverability was that Ashford had been anonymously funding the Webb Community Center for 11 years. The payments came through a series of intermediary accounts. Webb knew who they came from. He had honored the arrangement precisely as it had been offered, complete unbroken confidentiality with no acknowledgement and no exceptions. Which meant that Reese Calloway, who had spent 9 years of her life in that building, who had trained on the mats that Ashford's money paid for under the lights that Ashford's money kept on, had never heard his name, had no idea he existed, and was about to save his life. Victor Hale had a different relationship with Robert Ashford. Hale had spent the better part of 14 months positioning himself as a middleman in a real estate transaction involving 3 properties on the south side of Chicago. Properties that were poised for significant appreciation once a city infrastructure project cleared the Planning Commission, a project that was not yet public knowledge, but that Hale had been made aware of through the particular kind of informal network that exists in every city between local government offices and private real estate interests. The transaction required one thing that Hale had not been able to obtain: Robert Ashford's signature. Ashford had been stalling for months. Not refusing stalling. He had not said no. He had said he was reviewing the terms. He had said he wanted to consult additional counsel. He had said most recently, and with a finality, that Hale found both infuriating and unacceptable. "I do not think this is something I want to participate in." Hale had tried every legal avenue. He had offered revised terms. He had offered a finder's fee structure that was by any reasonable accounting extraordinarily generous. He had deployed 2 separate lawyers and a financial consultant. Nothing had worked, and now the window for the transaction was narrowing. The infrastructure project would clear the Planning Commission within 90 days. Once it became public, the property valuations would shift, and the leverage that made the transaction valuable would be gone. Hale was not in his own self-conception a violent man. He was a manager. He understood leverage. He understood that the most effective pressure was the kind that created movement without leaving marks. But there are moments when men who believe themselves to be above a certain kind of action find themselves contemplating exactly that action. And in those moments, what separates the ones who cross the line from the ones who do not is rarely principle. It is almost always calculation about the likelihood of consequence. Victor Hale picked up a prepaid phone. Not his regular one, a prepaid device purchased in cash from a convenience store 400 meters from his building, a detail he considered sufficient to sever the connection between himself and whatever the phone subsequently did. He had not yet understood and would not understand until it was far too late that 400 meters is not a different neighborhood. It is a walk of less than 6 minutes. And the store had a camera that had been running continuously for 3 years. The call was short. His voice stayed low and even throughout. He gave a location, he gave a time window, he gave a name. He gave instructions that stopped precisely short of the thing he wanted, but made that thing entirely clear. The alley behind the Webb Community Center. Wednesday night. The old man walks alone. Make it bad enough that he signs. He did not say what needed to be signed. The man on the other end did not ask. 3 days before the alley, Victor Hale called Edna Calloway's unit that afternoon at a time he had confirmed through the building's security footage was 20 minutes before Reese would be coming in from school. He wanted her there when it happened. He wanted her to see. When they arrived, he let them both sit down. He placed a single sheet of paper on the desk without speaking. Edna reached forward and picked it up. Her hands were steadier than usual today, but her face as she read the number at the bottom did something that faces do when a person receives information that is technically comprehensible but practically catastrophic. The number absorbed the color from her expression and left something gray and still in its place. 40%. Effective the following month. No grace period, no alternative pathway, no language anywhere on the document that suggested room for discussion. Edna read it twice. The number at the bottom was more than she made in 3 weeks. Victor Hale leaned back in his chair. He turned his head and looked at Reese. Slowly, the full top-to-bottom assessment, and then the thin smile, not a warm one. The specific smile of a man who wants you to understand that he knows you cannot do anything about this and that this knowledge pleases him. Reese looked back at him. She did not speak. She did not move. Her expression did not change. She held his gaze for the full duration of that smile with the same calm, attentive steadiness she brought to every moment when someone tried to make her look away. That stillness cost her everything she had. There are things that 9 years of physical training genuinely prepare you for. They prepare you to absorb impact without tensing against it. They prepare you to control your breathing when your adrenaline is telling you to breathe faster. They prepare you to read a room in 3 seconds and identify where the pressure points are. What 9 years of training cannot do is stop a man with a lease agreement. Reese sat on the floor of her bedroom that night with the lights off for a long time, not crying or not for very long. A few minutes with her face pressed into her knees, feeling the specific suffocating frustration of knowing you are capable of something and having that capability be entirely irrelevant to the thing that is threatening to destroy the most important person in your life. She got up, washed her face, went to bed. The second pressure came from a different direction entirely. Her homeroom teacher called her in before first period the following day. There was a formal complaint filed in the school system submitted by the parent of another student. It stated with specific dates and locations that Reese had threatened the other student after school the previous week. The complaint named a witness. Every detail was credible enough to require an official response. Every detail was fabricated. Reese sat in the plastic chair across the desk and listened to all of it with the same attentive composure she brought to every situation where showing what she was feeling would cost her something. She did not interrupt. She did not produce the kind of emotional reaction that might read as either guilt or righteous indignation. She had no evidence to contradict it. The complaint had been designed with that gap in mind. What Reese did not know, what she would not learn until weeks later, was that the parent who filed the complaint lived 2 floors below her into the same building. They had been 63 days behind on rent when Victor Hale had mentioned during an otherwise routine conversation about their lease renewal that the Calloway girl had been creating problems in the building. He had mentioned it twice. He had paused meaningfully both times. The parent had drawn their own conclusions. That was how Victor Hale operated. No direct order, no fingerprints. Just information delivered with the right amount of implication to the right person at the right moment, and then left to do what implication does when it lands in the mind of someone who has reason to be afraid. The school's official process was now initiated, which meant that if anything else happened, anything at all, Reese had a behavioral record. That was the point. The third pressure arrived by certified mail, a letter on law firm letterhead notarized addressed to Edna Calloway. 3 pages. It formalized the rent increase notice and added a clause that had not been in the original document. If full payment was not received within 30 days, eviction proceedings would commence immediately. Reese read it at the kitchen table that evening while her grandmother was resting. She read all 3 pages. The legal language was dense in the particular way that legal language is dense when it has been written specifically to make a person of ordinary means feel that the situation is beyond their ability to navigate. Every clause referenced another clause. Every term had a defined meaning that was itself defined elsewhere. Reese read every word. Then she folded the letter into thirds, placed it on the kitchen table, and sat very still for a moment. She did not tell her grandmother about the eviction clause. She went to practice instead. That evening at the community center, Coach Darnell Webb watched Reese work through her combinations without saying anything for a long time. Her technique was correct. It was always correct. What he was watching was the quality of her focus. There is a kind of focus that comes from genuine engagement with a problem clean and forward-looking. And there is a different kind that comes from burning something off, from needing the physical act to absorb something the mind cannot hold still. She was doing the second thing. He let her go for a while. Then he said quietly, without making it a moment, "You're fighting angry tonight." She did not answer. He did not push. But he watched, and he remembered. The night before the alley. Reese went to the storage room in the basement of the building to retrieve her bicycle. She crouched down to check the tires as a habit before unlocking it from the rack. The rear tire was completely flat. She ran 2 fingers along the valve. It had been loosened deliberately. Not worn out, not damaged by road use, deliberately loosened. The kind of thing that takes 7 seconds and requires nothing but the willingness to crouch down and do it. Under the rear wheel, folded in half, was a small piece of paper. She picked it up, unfolded it, read it. 4 words. No signature. Know your place, girl. She stood up in the storage room. The fluorescent light above her had been flickering for 2 weeks. In the intermittent light, she read the words one more time, and then she did something that would not look like much to anyone watching. She folded the paper in half, placed it in the left pocket of her jacket, and stood still for a moment with both hands at her sides. She did not tear it. She did not crumple it. She did not throw it against the wall. She folded it and put it in her pocket, and whatever she felt in that moment, she kept entirely to herself. She pushed the bicycle home on foot. It was just under 6 blocks. She took the route she always took, which passed about halfway along the corner of the building, where Victor Hale's management office occupied the ground floor. The window faced the street. The light was on. She could see him through the glass. He was on the phone, his back turned half toward her shoulders. Relaxed, the posture of a man having a comfortable conversation with someone he did not need to perform for. She could not hear his voice. She could not see his face. But she could see the particular ease in his body, the complete settled confidence of a person who does not need to look over their shoulder because they have spent a long time making sure there is nothing behind them. Reese stopped walking. She stood on the sidewalk in the dark, 14 years old, holding the handlebars of a bicycle with a flat tire with a note folded in her jacket pocket, looking through a lit window at a man who did not know she was there. She stood there for 3 seconds exactly. Then she turned away from the window and continued down the sidewalk. The city made its sounds around her. A bus 2 blocks over, someone's music from above. The specific late evening rhythm of a neighborhood settling into itself after the day. She walked in the dark with the broken bicycle beside her and the note in her pocket, and something in her chest that was not quite anger and not quite grief, something heavier than both. The particular weight of understanding that the thing being used against you is not something you can reach, not something you can outrun or outthink or outmaneuver with any of the tools you have spent 9 years developing. She knew exactly what she was capable of. It had nothing to do with any of this. She arrived at the community center the next morning before anyone else. The lights in the training room were still in their overnight setting, half-dimmed, the kind of light that makes a space feel suspended between one state and another. She sat on the bench along the far wall and opened her phone. She had a video saved in a folder she did not show anyone. Footage from a regional tournament 2 years ago. Herself at 12, smaller than she was now, stepping onto a mat to face a girl 4 inches taller and 20 pounds heavier. She was not watching to study technique. She knew the technique. She was watching the version of herself who had walked onto that mat, looked at someone bigger and known, without doubt exactly what she was going to do. She was trying to remember what that certainty felt like. The specific quality of it not in the mind, but somewhere lower in the chest and the spine. The settled preparatory calm that is not the absence of awareness, but the full absorption of it. Coach Darnell Webb came in at 6:30 and found her there. He sat down on the bench beside her without a word. He did not ask what she was watching. He did not ask what was wrong. For a while, they sat in the half-light of the training room and said nothing the way two people can sit in silence when the silence is not empty. Then Reese asked without looking up if someone used what you taught them to protect another person. How does the law see that Webb was quiet for a moment? The kind of quiet that is not hesitation, it is consideration. Depends on the circumstances, he said, and on how people decide to see you. What does that mean? It means, he said carefully, that a black kid late at night in a dark alley, no matter what the reason is, the first story people tell will not be your story. She absorbed that, nodded slowly, the way she absorbed everything fully without rushing to respond. So if you ever have to act, he said, do exactly what is necessary, nothing more. And do not run, he said nothing else. Neither did she. Her phone buzzed, unknown number, one message. Don't go through the alley tonight. She stared at the screen for a long moment. Read it twice. Then she put the phone in her bag, stood up and walked to school. There is a thing that people who have not trained seriously sometimes misunderstand about physical preparation. They think of it as a set of techniques, a library of moves to be retrieved and applied. They imagine that what distinguishes a trained person from an untrained one is a collection of specific responses to specific situations. That is not what 9 years of real training builds. What 9 years builds is a different relationship with perception. You stop reacting to what is already happening and start reading what is about to happen. The shift of weight before the reach, the angle of the shoulder before the step, the moment of commitment, that fraction of a second when a person's body passes the point of no return on a particular motion and becomes briefly maximally vulnerable to being redirected. That fraction of a second is where all of it lives. Walking home from school that afternoon, Reese pulled her left earbud out 30 feet before the entrance to the alley between Dexter and Carver Streets. The right earbud had a short in the wire and only worked if she held her head at a particular angle, so she sometimes went with just the left one, in which meant the right side of her hearing was always partially open. She heard the sound from deep inside the alley. She stopped walking. She identified it before she consciously decided what to do about it. The specific acoustic signature of impact against a body rather than a surface. The rhythmic, deliberate quality of it, not frantic, not the chaos of a sudden confrontation, but methodical, purposeful. And then underneath that, a breath, compressed out of a chest that had almost nothing left in it. She had heard that sound once before. Her grandmother in a hospital room the previous winter. Reese pulled the left earbud out completely. She opened her phone and dialed 911. She gave the location in 3 words. She did not wait for a confirmation response. She put the phone in her jacket pocket, screen still on call, still connected, and she stepped into the dark. She could see 3 shapes at the midpoint of the alley, 1 shape on the ground, 3 standing around it. The one in the middle was the largest, and she understood from the way the other 2 oriented toward him that he was directing what was happening. He will react first. She was 30 feet in when the large one, Jake Mercer, turned around. He looked at her. He took in what he saw. Small, young, uniform, hair tie, and his expression moved through a brief involuntary sequence: recognition, assessment, and then dismissal. The dismissal completed itself in about half a second, which meant he never moved past it to the next calculation. That was the first mistake, and the only one that mattered. One of the others, Garrett Finch, moved to her right. The third one moved to her left. Mercer took 3 steps toward her and reached out one hand, not to strike, just to push her back. The motion of a man clearing something out of his way. A casual, confident reach in her direction, the gesture of someone who has never had a reason to consider that a reach like that could be the most consequential motion of his life. Reese did not step back. She stepped forward, into the gap that his reaching arm had just opened, into the space between his extended reach and the center of his body, where his balance was entirely committed to a motion that was already past its midpoint. Her right hand closed around his wrist with a precision that came from 10,000 repetitions on a rubber floor. Her hip came across and behind his lower than his center of gravity. Her weight dropped in less than a second. Jake Mercer, 6'2", 220 pounds, left the ground. He came down on his back with a sound that rang off both brick walls of the alley like a gunshot. The impact moved through the air and through the ground simultaneously. It was the sound of physics completing itself without any interest in the outcome. For a moment, the alley went completely still. Mercer was conscious. He was not getting up. His body had absorbed the full transfer of force from a throw executed with 9 years of precision, and what remained was not pain, so much as a temporary and total absence of any available response. Reese was standing with her hands at her sides, breathing normally. She looked at Garrett Finch and Levi Drummond. They looked at her. Then they looked at the man on the ground. 2 seconds passed, maybe 3. Then Garrett Finch ran. Levi Drummond was a half step behind him. Their footsteps echoed off the walls and disappeared into the street, and the alley went silent. On the second floor of the building that backed against the alley, 16-year-old Nolan Pruitt had been leaning out his bedroom window getting some air when he heard the first sounds. He had grabbed his phone. He was still recording. He had been recording for the last 4 minutes. Reese turned and walked to where the man on the ground was lying. She crouched down and pressed 2 fingers to his wrist. His pulse was there, present, if not strong. From her jacket pocket, the faint sound of a dispatcher's voice was still asking for confirmation. She pulled the phone out. Still on the line. "I'm in the alley now," she said. "The victim is conscious. I need medical response immediately." She put the phone back in her pocket without ending the call. She leaned forward so the man on the ground could see her face. "Sir, can you hear me? I've already called 911. You need to stay still. Don't try to get up." Robert Ashford opened his eyes. He saw a child kneeling in the dark beside him. School uniform, blue hair tie, completely calm, telling him in a voice that carried no tremor and no uncertainty to stay still. He tried to say something. She shook her head. "Don't talk. Just stay still." She stayed crouched beside him with 2 fingers on his wrist, monitoring his pulse until the first siren sounded 2 blocks away and began to move closer. She could see the light now at the end of the alley, the blue and red moving across the brick walls, reaching into the dark. She sat back on her heels. She was still holding his wrist. The first police unit arrived at the north entrance of the alley at 9:53 in the evening. Reese heard the doors before she saw the officers. 2 quick slams in succession, then footsteps moving fast on pavement, then a flashlight beam cutting across the mouth of the alley, and finding her immediately crouched beside a man on the ground, 2 fingers on his wrist, completely still. She stood up slowly. She put both hands where the light could see them. "My name is Reese Calloway. I'm 14 years old. I live at Building 4 on South Carver, 3 blocks that way. I called 911 before I entered the alley. I used physical force to stop an assault in progress. I stayed on scene." She said it the way people say things they have prepared for without knowing they were preparing for them. Not rehearsed, not flat, just clear. The specific clarity of someone who understood that the story being established in the next several minutes was going to matter in ways she could not yet fully calculate. The officer with the flashlight was young, late 20s, moving with the slightly over-calibrated alertness of someone who had not been doing this long enough for it to become automatic. He looked at Reese. He looked at the man on the ground. He looked at Jake Mercer, who was now sitting against the far wall of the alley, with his back against the brick and his knees bent, saying nothing. His expression, the particular blank of someone whose body has just informed him that the available options have narrowed considerably. The second officer had already called for medical. The radio on his shoulder crackled and confirmed unit en route 2 minutes. Reese walked to the curb at the north entrance of the alley and sat down. She placed her palms on her knees. She looked at the street in front of her. The ordinary street, the parked cars, the corner store, 2 blocks down with its fluorescent signs still on the entirely normal geography of a Wednesday evening on the south side of Chicago, and she breathed at a rate that was slightly slower than what her body was requesting. Up on the second floor of the building behind the alley, Nolan Pruitt was still at his window. He had been recording for just under 6 minutes total. He had not edited anything. He had not cropped or filtered or made any decision about the footage beyond the initial decision to point his phone at the alley when he heard the first sounds. He was 16 years old, and he was looking at his screen with an expression that suggested he was not entirely certain the footage he was looking at was footage he had actually taken, because the thing on his screen did not match any template he had for how the world was supposed to work. He watched the ambulance arrive. He watched the paramedics work on the older man on the ground with the focused economical efficiency of people who do this every night. He watched the girl's small school uniform, blue hair, tie sitting on the curb under the arriving lights of more police units, both palms resting on her knees waiting. He uploaded the video at 10:04 in the evening. He did not add music, He did not add text overlays or slow motion effects. He just wrote a caption and posted it to the platform where he had 43 followers, most of them classmates. She walked into that alley alone and took down the biggest guy with one move. He's like 3 times her size. Nobody is going to believe this. He was right that nobody was going to believe it. He was wrong about almost everything else. Robert Ashford was conscious when the paramedics reached him. He had 3 cracked ribs, a laceration above his left eye that would require 8 stitches, and a concussion that the attending physician at Northwestern Memorial would later describe as moderate. He was going to be in the hospital for 3 days. Before the ambulance doors closed, he turned his head and looked back down the block toward the alley entrance. The girl was still sitting on the curb, both hands on her knees. Under the lights of 2 police units in the ambulance, she looked simultaneously younger than 14 and older than anyone had a right to be at 14. She was looking at nothing in particular, or she was looking at everything in general, with that quality of attention that takes in a room without performing the act. Ashford looked at her the way you look at something that has just changed how you understand something you thought you understood. Then the doors closed. Reese sat on that curb for 40 minutes. A detective arrived 20 minutes in and pulled her aside. His name was Graves. He was in his mid-40s, tired in the specific way that Chicago detectives are tired on Wednesday evenings in October. He had a notepad and a voice recorder, and the practiced neutrality of someone who had learned that the appearance of objectivity was more useful in the first interview than either warmth or pressure. We need to ask you some questions about why you were in this alley tonight and whether you knew the victim before this evening. She answered everything directly. She had been walking home from school. She had taken this route hundreds of times. She had heard sounds from inside the alley. She had called 911 before she entered. She had used a single technique to stop the assault. She had stayed on scene. Graves wrote everything down. He asked her to repeat several things. He asked about her training. He asked whether she had received any communication about the attack before it happened. She looked at him for a moment before answering. I received a text message this afternoon from an unknown number, she said. It told me not to go through the alley tonight. Graves's pen stopped moving. He looked up. She showed him the message. He photographed the screen. He noted the timestamp and the number, and he wrote something on the notepad that she could not see. Do you have any idea who sent it? Oh, she said. That was true. At the time, it was entirely true. Graves thanked her. He told her someone would be in touch. He gave her a card with a case number on it. She put the card in her jacket pocket next to the folded piece of paper that said, "Know your place, girl." She walked home. At 10:04 in the evening, Nolan Pruitt's video had 43 potential viewers. By 11:30, it had been shared enough times that the platform's algorithm had taken notice. There is a particular pattern in viral content, a rate of early sharing that exceeds by a measurable multiple the baseline engagement rate for a given account's follower count. When that multiple crosses a certain threshold, the algorithm begins to amplify. The amplification increases the share rate, which increases the multiple. The video crossed that threshold at approximately 11:45. By midnight, the clip had 400,000 views. Reese was asleep by then. She had come home, told her grandmother in brief and careful terms what had happened, watched her grandmother's face move through 4 distinct expressions in about 8 seconds, and submitted to the kind of examination that grandmothers conduct, hands on the face, hands, checking the arms, the systematic assessment of someone who needs to verify with their own hands that the person in front of them is actually fine before the word fine means anything. She was fine. She went to her room, set her alarm for 4:59, and was asleep within 12 minutes. She did not look at her phone. At 6 o'clock the next morning, the clip had 2 million views. By 6:15, it had been picked up by 3 local news affiliates. By 7, a sports channel that covered combat athletics had posted a breakdown video using slow-motion replays of Nolan's footage frame by frame, with a commentator who kept returning to the same observation in different formulations. This is textbook. This is absolutely textbook. Look at the hip placement. Look at the timing. This is a technique that takes years to execute at this level, and she did it under pressure in a dark alley against a man twice her size, and she did it perfectly. By 8:45, the phrase "one move in the dark" was trending nationally. Reese woke at 4:59, measured her grandmother's medications, made coffee, and did not look at her phone until she was on the sidewalk heading to school. When she opened it to check the time, the notification count was a number she did not immediately process as a number, a sequence of digits that required a second reading before she understood it was not an error. She put the phone back in her bag. She kept walking. By the time she arrived at school, the clip had 38 million views. Two classmates stopped her in the hallway and said her name in the particular tone people use when they are not entirely certain the person in front of them is the same person they saw on their screen. A teacher passed her in the hall and looked at her differently than teachers usually looked at her, with something more alert, more recalibrated. Reese went to her homeroom. She sat down. She put her hands on the desk in front of her. Everyone who watched the clip came back to the same moment, the moment Jake Mercer's feet left the ground. There was something in that moment, something in the physics of it, in the geometry of one person's mass leaving the Earth and being redirected by a force that appeared to come from almost nothing, that people needed to watch more than once before they could account for it. The slow-motion replays helped. The frame-by-frame analyses helped. But even with all of it laid out in comprehensible increments, the moment retained something that explanation alone could not dissolve. She had not hesitated. She had not braced or adopted the posture of someone preparing for a confrontation. She had simply stepped forward inside the reach, and the man had left the ground. 2 seconds, 9 years. Victor Hale was on the phone before the ambulance had cleared the block on Wednesday night. He made 2 calls. The first was short, a single sentence to a number he deleted from his regular phone afterward. The second was to a contact at a local online news outlet, someone who had worked the city beat for 11 years and who owed Hale a favor of a specific kind, the kind that does not expire and does not get discussed directly, only referenced through the tone of a conversation when it becomes relevant. The call lasted 4 minutes. Hale did not accuse Reese Calloway of anything. He was careful about that, careful in the particular way of a man who has spent a decade deploying information without attaching his fingerprints to what that information does once it lands. He laid out facts, specific, accurate, individually innocuous facts. A teenage girl who regularly used the alley as a shortcut late in the evenings. A formal behavioral complaint recently filed against her through her school's official process. A financial dispute involving her grandmother's lease at a building where the assault victim held indirect property interests through a subsidiary of Ashford Holdings. He said all of this in the measured, regretful tone of a person reluctantly sharing information they feel obligated to share. He did not say she was involved. He did not say she had advanced knowledge. He did not say anything that could be directly attributed to him as an accusation. He just laid the pieces on the table and left the contact to arrange them in whatever configuration they preferred. By 7 in the morning, 2 online outlets had published stories. The headlines were crafted with the particular precision of headlines designed to generate both clicks and legal deniability. Teen girl's heroic rescue, or was she already there for another reason? Viral alley video raises questions. What was 14-year-old really doing out at night? The stories contained no outright falsehoods. They contained accurate information presented in a sequence and framing that invited a specific conclusion without stating it. They mentioned the behavioral complaint. They mentioned the late hour. They mentioned the financial connection between the assault victim and the building where the girl's grandmother lived. Each individual sentence taken alone was defensible. Together they built something. Comment sections filled within hours. For every person calling Reese a hero, there was someone asking why a girl her age was alone in an alley after dark. For every share of the slow-motion replay with the caption, "She saved his life," there was another thread asking whether a 14-year-old could genuinely have done that to a grown man without some kind of prior arrangement. Doubt moves fast, especially when someone with access to a news outlet is helping it along. By 9 in the morning, the school's administrative office had placed Reese on indefinite suspension pending the outcome of an official inquiry. The behavioral complaint that had been filed 3 days earlier, the one that had been fabricated, submitted by a parent who had drawn their own conclusions from a meaningful pause in a conversation about a lease, was now sitting at the top of her file. Visible, dated, officially processed. The school's decision was communicated to her by her homeroom teacher in the hallway. Reese listened without speaking. She was given a form to sign acknowledging she had received the notification. She signed it. She retrieved her bag from her locker. She walked to the front entrance and pushed through the doors into the morning. She stood on the front steps for a moment. The October air had the specific quality that Chicago air gets in mid-autumn, dry and cold at the edges, with something still warm at the center of it that will not last much longer. Reese walked home. The certified letter arrived at the apartment that same afternoon. Edna Calloway received it from the mailbox in the lobby, a thick envelope on law firm letterhead addressed to her by name. She brought it upstairs. She set it on the kitchen table. She looked at it for a moment before she opened it, the way you look at something when some part of you already knows that what is inside is going to require all of you to process. Reese took it from her. She read it standing at the kitchen table. It was a revised notice. The language made clear it superseded all prior written communications regarding the tenancy. The rent increase was formalized, and at the bottom of the second page in a paragraph structured to appear as a routine procedural addendum, rather than the central point of the document, was the timeline revision. 15 days to vacate, not 30. 15. The escalation had been prepared in advance. The language was too precise, the legal framework too carefully constructed for it to have been drafted in the 24 hours since the alley. This document had been ready and waiting. Victor Hale had simply been holding it until the moment when sending it would land with maximum force. That moment was now. Reese read it twice. She folded it into thirds. She opened the kitchen drawer where she kept the first letter and the school complaint form. She placed this new letter on top of the stack. She closed the drawer. She told her grandmother she was going to her room for a little while. She went to her room, sat down on the edge of her bed, and opened her phone. The view count had passed 50 million. She scrolled through the comments for approximately 10 minutes. She read them without expression, the ones calling her a hero, the ones calling her a plant, the ones asking questions that were not really questions. She read the headlines from the two news outlets. She read the comment sections on those. Then she set the phone face down on the bed. She lay back and looked at the ceiling. The ceiling of this room had a water stain near the far corner that had been there since she was 8 years old. She had looked at it enough times in enough different states of mind that it had become a kind of reference point, something fixed and present and completely indifferent to whatever was happening in the rest of her life. It was the same ceiling when things were fine and the same ceiling when they were not. She found this on some level useful. The door opened. Edna Calloway came in and sat on the edge of the bed. She did not say anything. She looked at her granddaughter looking at the ceiling, and she did not offer comfort in words because she understood with the particular understanding of a woman who had lived 67 years in circumstances that did not always leave room for comfort, that words were not what was needed right now. She reached over and placed her hand on Reese's arm. She left it there. That was all. Sometimes that is the only thing left. Not a solution, not a next step, not a reframing of the situation toward a more manageable perspective. Just a hand on an arm in a small room saying without any words at all, I am here and you are not alone in whatever this is. Reese did not move. She kept looking at the ceiling. She let herself feel what she was feeling for as long as she needed to feel it. In a private room at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, Robert Ashford was watching the clip on a tablet his assistant had brought him. He had watched it 11 times. He kept returning to the same thing. Not the throw itself, though the throw was extraordinary, and he understood enough about physical confrontation to recognize how extraordinary it was. What he kept returning to was the moment before, the moment when Mercer reached out that hand and the girl did not step back, the complete absence of hesitation, the step forward into exactly the space that the motion had opened. You do not acquire that in a month or a year. That is the physical product of a very long time of preparation committed to and sustained at a level that most adults cannot maintain, let alone a child carrying the weight she was clearly carrying. His assistant knocked and entered. The legal team representing Moore's management company wants a meeting. The assistant said, using the wrong name, out of habit, a careless conflation of property portfolios. They're saying the girl represents a liability. Ashford did not look up from the tablet. He was watching the throw again. The moment the feet left the ground. Get me Celeste Harmon, he said. Sir Celeste Harmon, the civil rights attorney. Find her number and get her on the phone today. The assistant wrote the name down and left. Ashford had been funding the Webb Community Center for 11 years. He had structured the funding anonymously because he had learned over 3 decades of dealing with the particular dynamics of money and gratitude that anonymous giving preserves something in the relationship between the giver and the work that named giving consistently destroyed. He had never met anyone who trained at the center. He had not known until he watched the clip 11 times in a hospital bed with 3 cracked ribs and 8 stitches above his eye that a girl had been showing up to that building every day for 9 years, building inside that building, with that man's instruction, the specific competence that had just saved his life. Sometimes the threads that hold everything together are invisible until someone puts them all in the same room. He reached for his phone. Victor Hale sat in his office that evening with the monitor showing 4 different camera feeds simultaneously. He had poured himself 2 fingers of scotch from the bottle he kept in the lower desk drawer. The doubt articles had performed exactly as he had anticipated. The comment sections were doing exactly what comment sections do when the right questions are asked in the right framing. The school had moved exactly as he expected. The eviction notice had been delivered. He swirled the scotch once and looked at the lobby camera feed. The only thing that had gone differently from the plan was the girl. She was not supposed to have been in the alley at all. He had sent the text from the prepaid device specifically to remove her from the equation, an anonymous message to redirect her route and keep her out of a situation that had nothing to do with her. She was an irrelevance, a variable that should have been easily managed. Instead, she had walked into the alley. Instead, she had put Jake Mercer on the ground in the 2 seconds. He turned this over in his mind. The clip was a complication but manageable. The media narrative was introducing the necessary doubt. The school suspension created an official institutional context that would color how any subsequent story about her would be read. The eviction notice kept her family occupied with survival rather than anything else. He had enough threads in motion. He took a sip of the scotch. What he did not know was that a woman named Celeste Harmon had received a phone call from a hospital room 2 hours earlier and had agreed to take a case before the caller had finished explaining the circumstances. He did not know that Celeste Harmon had a particular skill developed over 16 years of civil rights law in Chicago for looking at a pattern of events and identifying where the pattern had been constructed rather than allowed to occur naturally. He did not know that she had already asked for the footage, all of it, including the 43 seconds that Nolan Pruitt had not posted publicly. The clip passed 60 million views sometime after midnight. Reese was asleep. Before she closed her eyes, she had sent 3 words to Coach Darnell Webb. Was it enough? She put the phone on the nightstand. The reply came before she reached the edge of sleep. It was perfect. Now hold. She read it once. Put the phone down. He did not offer comfort. He offered precision. Those 2 categories had never overlapped in 9 years of knowing him, and she trusted them both for exactly that reason. She held. 2 things happened the following morning that Reese did not know about. The first, Celeste Harmon sat in her office on the 14th floor of a building downtown and laid out a timeline on her desk. She used a legal pad and a black pen and a ruler for the connecting lines, and she worked from the earliest date forward. Work backward and you find what you are looking for. Work forward and you find what is actually there. She started with the earliest date she had, the anonymous funding relationship between Robert Ashford and the Webb Community Center, 11 years. She worked forward from there. The moment Victor Hale had become aware of Ashford's identity in connection to that center. The timing of the rent increased notice, the timing of the behavioral complaint at the school, the timing of the law firm letter, the timing of Nolan Pruitt's upload relative to the alley event, the timing of the 2 media articles relative to Hale's known contact at the outlet. She drew lines between them with a ruler. She looked at the shape they made. Then she called the prosecutor's office handling the assault case and asked one question. A single specific question she had identified as the load-bearing point of the entire structure. How did 3 men know exactly which route Robert Ashford was walking at exactly what time on exactly that night? There was a pause on the other end of the line. The prosecutor did not have an answer. Harmon thanked him and ended the call. She looked at the timeline on her desk. She circled one name. The second thing, Jake Mercer, who was in county custody facing charges of aggravated battery and robbery, had a conversation with his public defender in a small room with no windows. The conversation lasted 14 minutes. Mercer emerged from it with a decision that the existence of Nolan Pruitt's footage had made considerably more straightforward to arrive at. He was prepared to cooperate. His conditions were modest: a reduced sentence, a facility transfer closer to his mother's home. What he was prepared to offer in return was specific. He had a name. He had the details of 2 phone calls. He knew what he had been told to do and what the purpose was. The assault on Robert Ashford had not been a robbery. It had never been a robbery. It was targeted coercion, delivered through violence as a final option after every available legal mechanism had failed, organized by a man who believed himself to be entirely insulated from consequence by the structure he had built around himself over 11 years of careful fingerprint-free operation. Mercer told the public defender to make the call. In her office on the 14th floor, Celeste Harmon's phone rang 30 minutes later. She listened. She asked 2 clarifying questions. She wrote a name on a separate piece of paper from the timeline. She placed it at the center of the desk and looked at it. She picked up her pen. She circled it. Twice. Celeste Harmon had a rule about new cases. She did not form conclusions before she had laid out every piece of available evidence in chronological order on a flat surface she could see all at once. Not a screen. A physical surface, her desk, the conference table in her office, occasionally the floor when there was enough material. She used a legal pad and a black pen and a ruler for the connecting lines, and she worked from the earliest date forward because the story a set of facts tells depends almost entirely on the order in which you encounter them. She had been doing this for 16 years. She had taken Reese Calloway's case before Robert Ashford finished explaining the circumstances because 2 minutes into the explanation she had already identified the shape of what she was looking at. She had seen the shape before, not the specific details, not the particular cast of characters, but the structure. The way pressure accumulates around a single person from multiple directions, simultaneously each source appearing independent, each individual action defensible in isolation, the aggregate effect devastating and entirely deliberate. She had seen it before. She had never seen it assembled quite this precisely around a 14-year-old girl. The materials came in over the course of Thursday and into Friday morning. The school complaint with its official filing date, the original rent increase notice, the law firm letter with the 15-day revision, the 2 online articles archived before they could be edited, the original police report from the alley with Detective Graves's notes attached, the full footage from Nolan Pruitt's phone, all 6 minutes and 47 seconds of it, including the 43 seconds that had never been posted publicly. She watched the full footage 3 times. On the third viewing, she paused at a specific frame and looked at the timestamp in the lower right corner of the screen. The timestamp was native to the phone embedded by the device at the moment of recording, not added afterward, not editable, without leaving a detectable trace in the file's metadata. The timestamp showed that Robert Ashford had been on the ground in the alley for 52 seconds before Reese Calloway appeared in the frame from the north entrance. 52 seconds. She had not been there before the assault. She had not been positioned in advance. She had not arrived with the men who attacked him or with any foreknowledge of what was going to happen in that alley on that night. She had walked in after the assault was already underway, having already called 911, and she had done what she did, and then she had stayed. The timestamp made all of this indisputable. Harmon wrote the number 52 on her legal pad and drew a box around it. Then one more detail from Graves's initial report caught her attention. The anonymous text message sent to Reese Calloway on the morning of the assault. "Don't go through the alley tonight" had come from a prepaid number. Harmon cross-referenced it against the phone records being pulled as part of the assault investigation. Same prepaid device, same purchase record. Victor Hale had tried to remove Reese from the equation because she was the one variable he had not planned for. The one person in the building he could not file away, could not predict, could not redirect with a meaningful pause in a conversation. He had tried to warn her away from the scene he had arranged. He had sent that text not to protect her, but to protect his plan. She had gone in anyway. And that, in the end, was the thread that had started everything unraveling. Harmon then called the prosecutor's office and asked her question. The question she had already identified as the place where the entire constructed narrative around Reese Calloway was most vulnerable. How did 3 men know exactly which route Robert Ashford was walking, at exactly what time, on exactly that night? The prosecutor's office did not have an answer. That silence was the beginning of the end of Victor Hale's carefully constructed world. Jake Mercer's cooperation agreement was formalized on Friday afternoon. He gave a name. He described 2 phone calls in detail, the first establishing the plan, the second placed 18 hours before the assault, confirming the route and the time. He described what he had been told the purpose was. He described the name of the LLC through which the finder's fee would have been channeled. He described the nature of the transaction that Ashford's signature was meant to authorize. He had been told it was not personal. It was business. The old man was stubborn about something he should have already agreed to, and a bad enough night would adjust his perspective. The prosecutor's office forwarded the cooperation agreement to Celeste Harmon within 2 hours of receiving it. She read it once to get the shape of it. Then she read it again slowly, noting every specific detail against the timeline she had built. Every date aligned, every phone call matched a gap in Hale's known communications record. Every specific detail of the LLC matched the financial documentation that Ashford's legal team had been able to pull from 3 years of stalled transaction records. She added one more line to the timeline, drew one more connecting line with the ruler. Then she called the detective assigned to the expanded assault investigation. She gave him a name, a phone number, and a store address. The store was a convenience mart 400 meters from Victor Hale's building. She told him to pull the exterior camera footage for a 48-hour window beginning Monday morning. The store had a functioning camera. It always had. Hale had purchased the prepaid phone at that store, not at a store across the city, not in a different neighborhood, but at the store closest to his building, 400 meters away, on a morning when he had presumably believed that a prepaid phone purchased in cash eliminated the connection between himself and anything the phone subsequently did. The camera footage was grainy, the quality of footage that a convenience store camera produces after 3 years of continuous operation without maintenance. But the jacket was distinctive. A dark jacket with a specific pattern of collar stitching and a band of lighter fabric along both sleeves. A jacket that appeared in 3 separate frames of the building's own lobby camera over the preceding 2 weeks each time on the same body. And the timestamp on the store footage was completely unambiguously clear. The thread that Victor Hale had left was not invisible. It had never been invisible. He had simply believed himself to be the kind of person about whom that kind of thread would never be pulled. That belief was the oldest mistake available to men who operate from a position of structural power for long enough that the absence of consequence begins to feel like immunity. It is not immunity, it is borrowed time. The deposition room was on the 14th floor of a building in the Loop. It had floor-to-ceiling windows on the north side that looked out over the city, the particular view of Chicago that makes the city look exactly as large and indifferent as it is. The conference table was long and dark and had the polished, serious quality of furniture that has been chosen specifically to communicate that the conversations held around it are consequential. Victor Hale arrived with 2 attorneys. He was in a new suit, dark blue, well-fitted, the kind that communicates through its quality that the person wearing it is accustomed to rooms like this. His expression was the one he used in situations where he was certain of the outcome, controlled, slightly bored, carrying the particular ease of a man who has been in rooms like this before and walked out of all of them without consequence. He had reasons to feel confident. He had the school behavioral file with its official complaint form. He had 2 online articles that had been published by recognized outlets and not retracted. He had a written statement from the parent who filed the complaint. He had 11 years of property management records showing no successful legal actions against him. He had a narrative constructed over 48 hours with the precision of someone who understood how narratives work that placed enough doubt around Reese Calloway to make the circumstances of the alley appear at minimum ambiguous. It was a good narrative, tightly built internally, consistent with just enough complexity to make clean contradiction difficult. Celeste Harmon sat across the table from him with a single manila folder in front of her. To her left, Reese Calloway sat with her hands resting on the table in front of her, still in the particular way that she was always still when a situation required everything she had to remain contained inside her. She was wearing a pressed white blouse. Her hair was pulled back. She looked younger than 14 in that room and older at the same time. The particular combination that comes from a childhood spent navigating situations designed for adults. The hearing officer called the session to order. Celeste Harmon opened the folder. She placed the first document on the table and slid it to the center. It was a still frame from Nolan Pruitt's unedited footage. The timestamp was circled in red. Beside it in Harmon's handwriting was a single number, 52 seconds. She did not explain it. She let the room read it. The first attorney leaned toward Hale and said something quietly. Hale's expression did not change. But his right hand, which had been resting with deliberate relaxation on the table, moved to his lap. Harmon placed the second document. The phone records from the prepaid device, 3 calls to Jake Mercer's number in a 24-hour window before the assault. The purchase record from the convenience store with the timestamp and the address. A still from the store's exterior camera, grainy, but with the jacket clearly visible and the timestamp perfectly clear. The same prepaid phone, she said, is the source of an anonymous text message sent to Reese Calloway the morning of the assault. The message told her not to go through the alley that night. The same device that organized the attack also tried to ensure she would not witness it. She was an unplanned variable, the only one he could not control. The first pillar cracked. She placed the third document, Jake Mercer's cooperation agreement, signed and witnessed. It named Victor Hale by name. It described both phone calls in specific detail, the first establishing the plan, the second confirming the route and the time. It named the LLC. It described the nature of the transaction and what Hale stood to receive if Ashford's signature had been obtained. The second attorney asked for a recess. The request was denied. The hearing officer looked at his notes for a moment. Then he looked at Reese. Miss Calloway, can you explain in your own words why you entered the alley rather than waiting outside and allowing emergency services to handle the situation? The room was very quiet. Reese looked at the hearing officer directly. Not at Hale, not at the attorneys, at the person who had asked her the question, which was the only person in the room she needed to look at. I had already called 911 before I went in, she said. I stayed outside for a moment first. I was going to wait. She paused. but the sound he made, the way his breathing sounded. I had heard that sound before. My grandmother made that sound in a hospital room last winter when she had a cardiac episode. It's a specific sound. It means someone is very close to the edge. She stopped. The room was completely still. I couldn't walk away from that sound. I had the ability to do something. I did the minimum necessary to stop the immediate harm, and then I stayed and waited for the police. Nothing in the room moved for several seconds. It was not the legal arguments that had done it, though the legal arguments were airtight. It was not the timestamp or the phone records or the cooperation agreement, though all of those were devastating. It was this, a 14-year-old girl explaining in the simplest possible language that she had heard a sound she recognized from the worst night of her grandmother's life, and that she had been unable to walk away from it, and that she had done exactly and only what was necessary, and that she had stayed. There was nothing in that account that could be reached by doubt, not because it was legally unassailable, though it was, but because it was the kind of truth that people recognize before they have consciously processed it, the specific, unrepeatable truth of a real action taken by a real person in a real moment for reasons that required no elaboration and admitted no counter-narrative. Hale's junior attorney was looking at the table. His senior attorney was looking at the window. The hearing officer was looking at Reese. Celeste Harmon did not speak. She did not need to. The hearing concluded 40 minutes later. Victor Hale and his attorneys left without speaking to anyone. They moved through the corridor with the particular pace of people who are managing their expressions while everything they came in with is gone. Hale did not look back. He did not look at Reese. He walked to the elevator and pressed the button and stood facing the doors until they opened and he stepped in and the doors closed. Reese sat in the deposition room for a moment after everyone else had gone. Harmon gathered her documents. She looked at Reese. "We'll have the ruling within the week," she said. "Based on what happened in this room today, I expect it to be complete and unambiguous." Reese nodded. She picked up her bag. She stood up. She looked around the room. The long, dark table, the windows showing the city spread out in every direction, large and entirely uninvested in what had just happened inside this room. "Thank you," she said. She walked out. There was one more move. On the morning following the deposition, Hale's senior attorney filed an emergency motion with the hearing officer. The motion argued that the anonymous payment, which had cleared Edna Calloway's outstanding rent, 14 months of accumulated balance arriving without a name or a note, constituted evidence of a coordinated arrangement between Reese Calloway and an unnamed third party with a financial interest in the outcome of the case. The motion used the word collusion 4 times in 3 pages. The argument was precise in the way that desperate arguments are sometimes precise, tightly written, technically formatted, and entirely hollow at the center. It was the last available piece of the structure Hale had been building since the night of the alley. A final attempt to use the very thing that had been done to help Reese as a mechanism to damage her. To take the one act of generosity in the entire story and make it look like evidence of conspiracy. Celeste Harmon received the motion at 7:50 in the morning. She filed her response at 9:42. The response was 6 pages. The core of it was simple: a payment made by a private individual to satisfy a lawful debt owed by a third party. Identity is not collusion. It is a private financial transaction. The identity of the payer is not relevant to the proceedings at hand, and the motion to compel disclosure has no legal basis in the current proceeding. Furthermore, the timing of the motion filed on the morning of the respondent's arrest on federal charges speaks to its purpose more clearly than any legal argument could. The hearing officer denied the motion by noon. He noted in the denial that the motion appeared to have been filed for the purpose of delay and intimidation rather than in good faith pursuit of legal remedy. He used the phrase "without merit." He used it twice. The last piece of the structure came down. Victor Hale's attorneys stopped filing motions. The formal ruling came 8 days after the deposition. It was issued in writing by the hearing officer, distributed simultaneously to all parties by courier, requiring signature confirmation of receipt. The document was 11 pages. The operative language was in pages 3 through 7. All proceedings against Reese Calloway were dismissed in full. The school behavioral complaint was stricken from her academic record, and the original complaint document was formally flagged as unsubstantiated. Her suspension was lifted effective immediately with a written acknowledgement from the school district that the suspension had been initiated without adequate justification. Her record was clean. The ruling on her conduct in the alley was specific and without equivocation. The document stated that the use of physical force had been proportional, reasonable, and consistent with the legal standard for defense of a third party under imminent threat of serious bodily harm. It noted in this language would be quoted in 17 subsequent news stories that the level of restraint demonstrated a single technique applied to one individual, resulting in no lasting physical injury, with immediate cessation of force once the threat was neutralized, was consistent with the conduct expected of a trained professional responder. She was 14 years old. She had trained for 9 years in a community center on the south side of Chicago. The system had just said in formal and unambiguous language with a notary stamp and a case number, and copies distributed to all relevant parties, she had done everything right. Victor Hale was arrested the following morning. The arrest took place at his management office on the ground floor of the building at 7:42 in the morning. 2 detectives and a uniformed officer. The charges were conspiracy to commit aggravated battery and wire fraud in connection with an attempt to coerce a property transaction through physical intimidation. The specific legal language had been developed over the preceding 72 hours by the prosecutor's office working in close coordination with Celeste Harmon, and it was precise in the way that charges are precise when they have been built from the inside out, from a cooperation agreement that named names and described conversations corroborated by physical evidence that required no interpretation. Hale said nothing when the handcuffs went on. He walked to the patrol car without resistance, without performance, with the particular stillness of a man who has watched every structural element of his carefully constructed position of power come apart at exactly the point where it had always been most exposed, not at the edges where he had always applied his defenses, but at the center where the thing he had believed made him untouchable had always been the most vulnerable. He had never lost an argument with a tenant. He had never considered that an argument could be made from a different direction entirely. The arrest was reported by local and national outlets before 9 in the morning. By that afternoon, the tenants of the building had begun calling the Chicago Housing Authority. The calls came in for 3 days. Complaints that were years-old complaints that had been filed and quietly closed or never formally filed at all, because the tenants had understood at a cellular level what filing would cost them, were now being submitted with documentation, with dates, with names attached. The full picture of how Victor Hale had operated across 11 years began to emerge piece by piece from people who had been silent for a very long time because silence had been the only available option, until it was not. The fraud investigation that opened as a secondary inquiry subsequently identified 4 additional transactions connected to the same LLC involving properties in 3 separate city districts. The pattern in those transactions was structurally identical to the Ashford situation, a target with the financial means to resist a series of escalating pressures and a final mechanism designed to force compliance without leaving a traceable connection to the man applying it. The same jacket, different rooms. The eviction notice against Edna Calloway was withdrawn by the newly appointed building management company within 24 hours of Hale's arrest. 2 days before that, the total outstanding balance on the apartment, 14 months of accumulated rent fees, late penalties, and all associated costs had been cleared by a single payment from a private account. The payment arrived as a wire transfer with a reference number and nothing else. No covering letter, no name, no note of any kind. Edna Calloway called the management company 3 times to confirm it was real before she allowed herself to believe it. On the morning the ruling came through, Celeste Harmon called Reese at 11:15. "It's over," she said. "Everything dismissed. You're completely clear." A brief silence. "Okay," Reese said. "Okay. Thank you, Miss Harmon." Genuinely. She ended the call. She sat on the edge of her bed. She breathed in once, breathed out. Then she got up, went to the kitchen, measured out her grandmother's afternoon medication, placed a glass of water beside it on the counter, and started thinking about what to make for dinner. The ceiling of her room still had the water stain in the far corner. Everything else was different. Robert Ashford held his press conference 5 days after his discharge from Northwestern Memorial. He arrived in a wheelchair, not because he required one for mobility at that point, but because his physician had recommended it for the first 2 weeks, and Ashford had learned over 58 years of making decisions to take medical advice from people who knew more than he did about the subject at hand. He was positioned behind a small podium set at a height appropriate for someone seated. The room held 43 journalists. Every seat was taken. His communications director had prepared a statement, 4 pages carefully reviewed by the legal team covering the facts of the assault, his recovery, his gratitude for the emergency response, a brief and general acknowledgement of Reese Calloway's role, worded with the specific caution of language that has been pre-approved by multiple lawyers. Ashford looked at the statement on the podium. He turned it face down. He spoke without notes for 6 minutes. He had not prepared what he was going to say. He had not needed to because What came out of him was not performance and not strategy. It was the thing that a person says when they have spent 8 days in a hospital bed, working something out in the silence of recovery, and the thing finally has a room to come into. He announced two things. The first, all rental properties in which Ashford Holdings held a direct or indirect ownership stake within the Southside District would be subject to an immediate and binding 5-year rent freeze with an independent tenant review board established to evaluate and approve any proposed increases after the freeze period. The board would be composed of current tenants, a legal advocate, and a city housing representative. Its decisions would be binding, not advisory. The second, the Webb Community Center would receive funding sufficient to construct and operate a new dedicated wing. The wing would house a free program for all youth under 18 in the district, personal safety training and legal literacy education year-round, requiring no application, no prior experience, no financial contribution of any kind. Any young person who walked through the door would be admitted. He paused before he said the name of the program. It will be called the One Move Program. He let that sit for a moment. Let the room absorb it. I have been supporting this community quietly for over a decade, he said, because I believed in what it was building. I did not have the vision to see what it had already built. He said nothing else from the podium. The room stayed quiet for 2 full seconds after he finished, the particular quiet that follows a statement that has been received rather than just heard, and then the questions began. He answered 4 of them. Then he signaled to his assistant that he was done. Reese had been standing against the back wall of the press conference room for the entire duration. She had arrived 20 minutes before it began, found a position against the wall where she could see the room without being immediately visible, and she had stood there through the setup and the filing of journalists and the quiet administrative details that precede any public event. She had stood there through Ashford's 6 minutes with her hands clasped in front of her, her weight balanced evenly on both feet. She had not been announced. She had not been introduced. She had not been positioned in any way that would make her visible before she chose to be. She stood against the back wall and watched. After the room had largely emptied, journalists filing out, cameras being packed, the ambient machinery of press coverage reassembling itself for the next location, Ashford's assistant began to move the wheelchair toward the side exit. Ashford held up one hand. He had seen her. She had not moved. She was still against the back wall, standing with her weight even and her hands clasped and her attention on the room in the particular way she had of taking everything in without performing the act. He moved his wheelchair toward the corner where she was standing. She did not come to him. She stood and waited, the way she always waited, still attentive, entirely present, with none of the fidgeting or self-consciousness that would have been understandable in a 14-year-old meeting for the first time the man whose life she had saved. He stopped in front of her. He had watched 41 iterations of the footage of her in that alley. He had watched the throw from every angle that Nolan Pruitt's footage provided. He had watched the moment she crouched beside him and put 2 fingers on his wrist with the focus of someone who had reduced the entire scope of a situation to its single most relevant element. He had thought in the hospital about the sound his breathing must have made in that alley. He had thought about a grandmother in a hospital room. He had thought about 9 years of a child showing up every single day to a building he had made possible without ever knowing she was there. "Thank you," he said. She looked at him directly. The same level, clear attention she had brought to every difficult situation since she was old enough for situations to require it. "Don't waste it," she said. He nodded once. She nodded back. That was all. The hashtag did not disappear after the verdict. It shifted. Housing advocacy organizations across the country picked it up for campaigns against predatory lease practices. Self-defense instructors and community programs used it to share curriculum resources and access pathways for young people whose families could not afford private training. Parents shared the story with their daughters. Educators used the footage in discussions about institutional response and the gap between stated policy and actual practice. The clip passed 160 million views. Nolan Pruitt was interviewed by 4 national outlets and gave every one of them the same answer when asked why he had posted the footage without editing it. "Because it happened," he said, "and things that actually happened deserve to be seen." 6 months after the alley, the new wing of the Webb Community Center opened on a Saturday morning in early October. The space was new in the specific way that newly built spaces are: new, fresh paint, rubber flooring that still carried a faint trace of the manufacturing process, lighting that was slightly too bright because it had not yet been adjusted to the particular purposes of the room. 16 students stood in 2 rows when the session began. Most of them were girls. Most of them were between 12 and 17. Most of them lived within a 6-block radius of the building. Several of them had watched the clip more than once before signing up. One of them had watched it 31 times. She had told her mother after the third viewing, "I want to learn how to do that." Her mother had signed the registration form the same day. Coach Darnell Webb stood in the doorway of the new wing with his arms crossed and watched the room fill. He had the expression he always had at the beginning of something outwardly composed, inwardly something considerably more than that. He had started this program with a folding mat and borrowed equipment in a room that smelled like old basketball leather and never quite warmed up in winter. He had believed without evidence and for a very long time that what he was doing mattered. He had believed it specifically on the days when it was hardest to believe. He looked at the room. He let himself feel briefly and quietly that he had been right. At the front of the room, standing with her feet shoulder-width apart and her hands clasped in front of her, was Reese Calloway. She was still 14. She would turn 15 in December. She was wearing the same type of training clothes she had worn for 9 years, the knees slightly worn from the mat, the fabric softened by hundreds of washes until it had achieved the particular quality of clothing that has been used for its actual purpose long enough to become part of the person using it. Her hair was pulled back with a blue hair tie. She looked around the 2 rows of students in front of her, the way Webb had always looked at a new group reading the room, noting who was nervous and suppressing it, who was already carrying something they had not yet learned to set down during practice, who was here because they wanted to be, and who had not yet decided. She had been every one of those students at different points. She recognized each of them without judgment. She waited until the room was fully quiet. The specific quiet that comes when everyone has finished arranging themselves and the next thing that happens will be the beginning of something real. Then she said, "The most important thing you will learn here is not a specific move. It is that you have the right to protect yourself and the people you love. Everything else we do here is built on that. Once you understand that the right belongs to you, the techniques follow naturally." She paused for a beat. "Let's start." Edna Calloway was in the front row of chairs along the wall. She had arrived early enough to secure a seat with a clear sight line to the center of the room. She was wearing the blue dress she wore to church and to occasions she considered significant, a category she had always been precise about. Her hands were folded in her lap. The hands that shook in the mornings were still this morning steadied by something that was not medication, and not the particular mercy of a good day, but something closer to the specific peace of a person watching their life arrive at a moment they had not known they were building toward. She watched her granddaughter move through the room with the patient, precise focus of someone who is not performing expertise, but simply using it, correcting a stance here, adjusting a grip there, naming what is happening in a body and language plain enough that the body itself could hear it and respond. The expression on Edna Calloway's face would have required several paragraphs to describe with any accuracy. Anyone who has ever watched someone they love become fully themselves, not a version of themselves constrained by circumstance or diminished by what the world has told them they are worth, but the actual complete version inhabiting their own knowledge with the ease of something finally allowed to be what it always was, would have recognized the expression immediately. Because it is a specific kind of joy, quiet and absolute and not quite containable, even in a person who has spent 67 years learning to contain things. Robert Ashford arrived 20 minutes into the session through the side entrance. He came in quietly. No assistant, no advance notification to anyone in the room. He found a position near the back wall, the same wall Reese had stood against at his press conference, and he stood there and watched. He stayed for 45 minutes. He watched Reese move from student to student with the specific focused patience of someone who has so fully inhabited what they know that they no longer need to think about it as knowledge. It simply is the way the ground under your feet is the way breathing is. Present, reliable, available without effort. He watched her stop beside a girl of about 12 first week carrying her weight too far back on her heels, a common error in people who have not yet learned that stability and readiness occupy the same position. Reese placed both hands on the girl's shoulders and shifted her forward gently 1/2 inch, no more. There she said, "That's your ground. Now you can move from it." The girl adjusted, tried the movement again. It was different immediately. She could feel the difference herself, which was the only way any of this ever really worked. Not from being told, but from the body discovering it directly from the inside out. She looked up at Reese. Reese nodded once, moved on. Before he left, Ashford stopped beside Coach Darnell Webb in the doorway. "Is she going to be all right?" he asked quietly. Webb looked at Reese at the front of the room. Moving, adjusting, teaching, completely in her element, which was not a phrase anyone who had known her for the past 3 months could have used without accounting for how much it had cost her to arrive at this particular element in this particular room. She was always going to be all right, Webb said. People just kept getting in her way. Ashford stood in the doorway for a moment longer. Then he walked out through the side entrance into the October morning, into the ordinary sounds of a neighborhood conducting its Saturday business, a food truck 2 blocks over, children on someone's stoop, a bus, the particular texture of a city going about its life in the specific, unspectacular way that cities do, and he walked the 3 blocks to where his car was parked and went home. The last image of this story is a close-up, Reese Calloway's hands, the same hands that measured medication at 4:59 in the morning, with the precision that shaking hands could not provide because the margin for error was zero, and somebody had to be steady, and she had decided at some point so early that she could not remember making the decision that it would be her. The same hands that folded a note that said, "Know your place, girl," and placed it in a pocket without crumpling it, because crumpling it would have been a response, and she had not yet decided what kind of response the moment deserved. The same hands that dialed 911 from the entrance of a dark alley and then closed around a wrist with 10,000 repetitions of precision behind them and redirected 220 pounds of mass using nothing but geometry and 9 years of showing up to a room with rubber floors every single day after school. The same hands that placed 2 fingers on a stranger's pulse in the dark and held them there steady and attentive until the sirens got close enough that she could see the light coming to meet her. Those hands in a new room on a Saturday morning in October are holding the wrist of a 12-year-old girl who has not yet been taught that her body belongs to her, that the ground under her feet is hers to stand on, that the right to be present and capable and not moved aside, it is not something that has to be earned or justified or defended before a hearing officer in a room on the 14th floor of a building downtown. It is something she already owns. Reese places the girl's wrist into exactly the right position. Steady, precise, unhurried, with the full attention of someone who understands from the inside out and not the outside, in that real strength is not about size or volume or the willingness to take up space. It is about knowledge, about preparation, about showing up for the people in the moments that need you even when no one expects you to, even when the world has already arranged things to suggest that you don't count, even when the note under your bicycle tire says know your place and the eviction clock is running and the comment sections are asking the wrong questions, and the institutional machinery has been quietly pointed in your direction by a man in a too tight dress shirt who believed he was the only one in the room keeping score. She never asked to be a symbol. She only refused to be invisible. And sometimes if you have done the work, if you have held your ground through the mornings that required everything you had just to get to the next morning, if you have kept your hands steady when everything around you was specifically and deliberately designed to make them shake, sometimes one move is enough to change everything. Not just for the man in the alley, not just for the grandmother in the blue dress in the front row, not just for 16 students standing in 2 rows on a rubber floor on a Saturday morning in October, learning for the first time that the ground under their feet is theirs. For those of you who have watched someone stand their ground when the whole room expected them to fold, when the institution was against them, when the paperwork was against them, when the narrative had been carefully constructed to ensure a particular outcome. You know what that looks like. You know what it costs. You know why it matters, that sometimes it works. And you know because you have lived long enough to know that the people who make it work are almost never the ones anyone was watching. They are the quiet ones. The ones keeping their hands steady at 5 in the morning when nobody is looking. The ones who already knew their ground. They just needed the moment to prove it.